Good evening. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Institute of Politics and the Women in Public Policy program to the Kennedy School of Government's Forum. This evening we have a wonderful speaker, Patricia Ireland, who's the president of the National Organization for Women. I can see there are some faces in the audience who aren't familiar with the Women in Public Policy program. We have two main goals. We focus on women in leadership, and we also focus on women in the public policy process. Patricia Ireland is a wonderful speaker on both counts. Not only is she a tremendous woman leader, but she has worked tirelessly over the past 10 years to focus on women in public policy. She's worked with policymakers in Washington, D.C., with local activists across the country. The National Organization for Women has chapters in all 50 states. And in addition, Patricia Ireland, I think, has basically been perpetually on the road for the last 10 years helping women. And she has focused on what is the cutting edge for women in policy right now? What are the next steps in the new millennium? And she has been a stellar speaker on behalf of the organization, has grown it enormously, and has made it the most successful in the country. Tonight's program has been put on by some of our own activists. I know we have many different student groups who helped put this together, including the Harvard Students for Choice. I assume some of you are out there. The Kappa Alpha Theta organization, the Kennedy School Women's Students Association, and the Progressive Jewish Alliance. Before I turn the program over to Patricia, I want to tell you a story. 10 years ago, long before I had decided I would focus my own career on feminism, Patricia Ireland gave a speech at Boston University. I attended with about 250 other members of NOW from Massachusetts, and she told a story which struck me. And I've thought about it frequently over the last decade. She talked about her journey and how she began as an activist. She was a flight attendant, and she would walk up and down the aisles, and she would take people's leftovers, a cup, a plate, a half a bagel, and she would say, thank you very much, thank you. And she then talked about how that's what women had been doing for years, whether it was in the halls of Congress, whether it was in Senate meeting rooms and legislatures across the country. They would take what was left over, and they would say, thank you very much for that. And Patricia Ireland has spent the last 10 years making sure that women aren't getting the leftovers, but the main course. So I look forward to hearing her remarks tonight, and I thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always dangerous to tell stories and then have people remember them. Actually, I think that Victoria cleaned that up a little. I believe I said we'd been taking people's garbage and thanking them, but well, I thank you for being here. It's wonderful, isn't it? The first day of spring, and I have enjoyed it thoroughly today, and I understand it's getting ready to snow. It's also Women's History Month, which is a good time for me. I do indeed a lot of traveling. I still have a home in just north of Key Largo and a home in Washington. At one point when I first became president of NOW, my goddaughter was asked by a reporter, where does Patricia live? And she answered with what I thought was rather astute for a then 8-year-old, that I lived in an airplane. But I thank you for inviting me here. I thank you especially for getting me out of Washington. We are just recovering from the election that wouldn't end. I know that you all went through it as well, and I try to find some humor in it somewhere. I guess that for me, the funniest of the candidates was probably Gary Bauer. I don't know if you found him as amusing as I did, but for example, at one point in the campaign, he called a news conference to announce that he was not having an affair with a female staff member. We were shocked. We didn't know he had staff, but actually he had 20 million tax dollars in matching funds. So yes, he had staff, and he got to travel around the country talking about his politics, and so I hope one of you will run for president soon. He also came up with what to me was classic in response to the Vermont Supreme Court's decision that under that state's equal protection clause in their constitution, they were obligated to provide the same rights and responsibilities, the same burdens and benefits for lesbian and gay couples in committed relationships that heterosexual married couples had. Now, they didn't use the M word. They didn't say that anybody had to, sanctify their marriage, but they did say they had to have equal rights and responsibilities legally. Well, Gary Bauer was totally crazed. He was almost speechless. He sputtered about that decision and finally found the words to express his dismay and disgust by saying, what the Vermont Supreme Court has done is worse than terrorism. And I had this sudden image of a terrorist bursting into the United Nations going, nobody move. I've got a gay couple here and I'm not afraid to use them. And I was like, well, you have to laugh because otherwise you'd have to blow something up and that would be wrong. Well, of course, now we are, 3 months into the Bush administration. And I have to say that the Bush administration, I don't know about President Bush himself, but the Bush administration has turned out to be much more politically astute than most people anticipated. I think it was somewhat the lowered expectations process that went with the debates, for instance, where people expected so little that he ended up looking like he did very well. And I'm anticipating that at some point we will start seeing the end of this honeymoon, but right now I think that he does look fairly astute. I know that there are many issues before us, whether it is the tax cuts, the budget proposals, what are we doing about Social Security and Medicare, the wage gap between the typical man and the typical woman has widened. We were down to 75 cents on the dollar, and I was waiting for my extra quarter, and now it's at 78 cents. I'm sorry, yes. It went from 75 down to 72. So we are now 28 cents away, and that's for median annual earnings. And there's a lot on our plates right now, and yet, to me, I keep going back to one of the very popular buttons that I brought back from California when the Democratic National Convention was out there. And it's the button that said, it's the Supreme Court, stupid. And I have to say that, in my view, despite all of the immediate concerns, and I have a lot of them, which I would love to share with you, but we only have 20 or 25 minutes, and then I want to hear from you. I want to have some discussion. It is the Supreme Court, and it's also another 94 federal court positions that are vacant, among them more than a dozen on appellate level courts right below the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has been 5-4, 4-5, 5-4, 4-5 on so many decisions, and sometimes it goes the way I want, and oftentimes it doesn't. And so, for instance, we saw in the recent past decisions saying that the United States Congress could not only did the Constitution not give women protection that entitled us to a civil remedy in federal district court when we faced bias crimes, that is, violence against women because of our sex, but that the Congress was not empowered to enact such legislation. They were constitutionally prohibited from enacting such legislation. So the Violence Against Women Act was basically substantially narrowed. The Age Discrimination Act and the Americans with Disability Act were both ruled as not applying to state employees in some fairly egregious cases. Those were all 5-4. 4-5, the court did uphold a right to be free from sexual harassment in public schools. You can hold a school liable if they willfully ignore what's happening to you, and that is a fairly high standard to meet, and that was a 5-4 decision, again, on just egregious facts that I was appalled it was only 5-4. And on abortion rights, we are now 5-4, with Sandra Day O'Connor holding the swing vote. The standard for what is constitutionally protected right now is whatever Sandra Day O'Connor thinks is an undue burden, not a particularly comforting position to be in, as we see both the facts that we know and the wonderful gossip that goes around Washington. I know that many of you heard the story that when Florida was called for Gore on election eve, that Sandra Day O'Connor basically, with a great exhale, said, "Oh, now I can't retire this, for another 4 years." The rumors are hot and heavy in Washington that she will retire by the end of this term, that is, by this summer. She will retire. And while she has been on the states' rights side of many of the issues and many of the cases, because she was in the Arizona legislature, and while we know that states' rights has not historically been a good theory for individual rights, women's rights, civil rights, nevertheless, she does hold the question of reproductive freedom in her hands, which then takes us to the Senate. You all know, of course, that the United States Senate is 50-50 right now, and all eyes in Washington, at least, well, Democrat and Republican eyes, are on Strom Thurmond. And Strom Thurmond is held up and functioning only by the strength of his will and some duct tape and baling wire. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, although I disagree with his politics. I mean, he is really not functioning. He did come out of the hospital where he'd been for exhaustion and dehydration. It's a couple of times he's been in and out of the hospital. He is no longer performing even the ceremonial duty that he had of going every morning and giving the formal opening to the court, to the Senate. I got the court on my brain. And so everybody is holding their breath on Strom Thurmond's health. I went down to Spartanburg, South Carolina, just to see what was going on down there, as Strom is now in his office, teetering on the edge. And South Carolina, for those of you who don't know, has got a Democratic governor, Jim Hodges. And everybody is so freaked out about whether Strom can last another 2 years till the next election, when Lindsey Graham is apparently going to run for the seat. And of course, the downside of that is that Lindsey Graham is as bad politically from my point of view as Strom Thurmond, but he is young and vigorous. But they got to get through these next 2 years, because Jim Hodges is a Democrat and could appoint a Democrat, which would mean that the whole power structure flips. And Cheney doesn't hold that deciding vote, and the Democrats, we don't have Jesse Helms heading up the Foreign Relations Committee anymore, just as an example. So I went down there, and everybody down there is freaking freely. It is an overwhelmingly Republican state. He's from one of the maybe 2 Democratic leaning counties in the state. And who knows who he's going to appoint. The Congress went so far, this states' rights, anti-federal, anti-big government Congress actually went so far as to say out loud, so it got picked up in the Washington Post, that they were looking for some constitutional way to require Jim Hodges to appoint a Republican if Strom didn't make it through the next 2 years. So it's very interesting. South Carolina also, just the day before I got there, just to make my visit worth my while, in the state legislature passed out of the House a law that cuts off state funding for contraception for unmarried couples. So, of course, we all know what that means. They will stop having sex, right? I mean, I'm sure that's going to be the result, don't you think? So here is the irony, here is the contradiction, the self-defeating attitude of those who are anti-abortion rights, but they don't want you to have contraception either. Meanwhile, RU 486 is being reviewed for safety, which has been used around the world by hundreds of thousands of women safely, and Viagra, which has already killed 5 or 7 guys, and which now appears to make you go blind, or at least that is a possibility. Your mother was right, okay? I'm telling you, it's an interesting time in politics, we are history. This is, can you imagine reading about this when your kids are, having kids of their own and they're studying history and they come back to ask you about these times? Where were you? Can you believe, did that really happen? Yes, it did. And South Carolina also had sent up a case to the United States Supreme Court on restrictions on the facilities that could provide abortion. Basically, they put into place restrictions that limit everything from the air filters to the size of the waiting areas, and it was refused a review by the Supreme Court, which meant that it left standing the appellate court decision that said that law was okay. Immediately, all of the Washington legal community, especially the constitutional and Supreme Court scholars, started buzzing that the Supreme Court was not going to hear another abortion rights case until they had their fifth vote. So it is a time where not only abortion rights, but many, many issues of the direction of our country, and what could make it clearer than at this point in our history that the Constitution protects what the Supreme Court says it protects. And that long after any Bush, the second administration, long before George III comes along, we will be living with the Supreme Court and the judiciary that is appointed in this term. If Bush is a one or a two-term president, the legacy will be, at least for the rest of my life and perhaps for some of yours. Congress right now is more polarized than the country. The White House is further to the right than the country. I was intrigued with a recent study that showed that the pander gap is closing. 20 years ago, Congress agreed with public opinion or moved with public opinion about 2/3 of the time. In the last couple of years, it's now down to 40%. Congress is out of step in the legislation with public opinion 60% of the time. They only are with public opinion 40% of the time. So why do they do all that polling and all those focus groups and all? To figure out how to sell their pre-decided positions, which I think is a fascinating process. So all of this is going on. The wage gap is widening, the wage and wealth gap is widening, and at the same time, I am here wanting to talk to you overwhelmingly about reproductive rights and reproductive freedom. And I do that for a number of reasons. One is I think that abortion and birth control, reproductive rights, are fundamental. They are fundamental rights. It is Women's History Month. I cannot think of a greater breakthrough in women's recent history than the ability to control our own fertility, starting with the birth control pill and moving forward to recognition. Remember, in my adult lifetime, I will tell you, when I got married, I was living in Valparaiso, Indiana. It was a town of 20,000. My engagement had been announced in the local paper. It was going to be the social event of the season. I took my mother with me to the doctor as additional credibility when I went to ask for birth control. And the doctor said, "Come back after the ceremony." I think he was from South Carolina. Now, I was not sure how that was supposed to work. We were going to exchange vows, go to the reception, swing by his office on the way to our honeymoon. Now I know that as late as that, in my adult lifetime, when I was getting married, birth control was illegal, even for married couples in some states in this country. It has been that recent a breakthrough. And while it was not illegal in Indiana, I can tell you it was not widely available. It was not easily obtained. And so I think it's fundamental. I don't think that women can participate fully in the social, political, economic life of our country without being able to decide whether and when to have children. I know that the implications for the right to privacy, the right to self-determination, the right to be free from government intervention in the most intimate aspects of our life have implications far beyond reproductive choices. I also know that right now the Congress is clearly coming after birth control as well as abortion rights. It's not only South Carolina. The House has again before them a bill that they passed last session, which would require parental consent for contraception if you are a teenager. And again, I think all the teenagers will stop having sex. So I think in particular the right to privacy in general, the individual rights are affected in a very fundamental way by this struggle. Second, I think that it is extremely symbolic. It is a turn that we've seen from classic conservative philosophy and politics, which is government out of your life, to social conservative message. And it is a pull that reflects what's happened to the Republican Party in the last 20, 25 years, away from traditional conservatism, away from Barry Goldwater. Whoever thought I would live long enough to think Barry Goldwater was, in comparison, okay, only okay, but better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick. So we see this, the pull towards social conservatism and toward that cultural desire to impose a particular view on the rest of us. The third reason I think abortion rights is a key issue is because it is sexy. And I mean literally because it has to do with sex. And that means that we get a lot of coverage and a lot of visibility around that issue. The work that we do, and we do a lot of work, for instance, right now on Social Security reform proposals to make it more equitable. If they're going to open it all up and we can talk about it, how about getting some sort of acknowledgement for the work that women do in our homes? Most women will be the majority, overwhelming majority of our lives in the waged workforce, but those who are economically able to do so often take out a number of years while their children are small to get them started and get them into school and then go back into the waged workforce. And not only do you derail your career, but you also get big fat goose egg zeros averaged into your wage record, which brings your Social Security benefits down when you retire. We're doing all that work. You don't see that in the paper. You know, that doesn't get the call-in shows lit up when I go on television or radio. And people are passionate and willing to mobilize around the issue of abortion. I mean, people get it. They get in many cases, I think people feel a disconnect between what's going on in Washington and what's going on in their day-to-day lives. I think on abortion rights, birth control, family planning, they get it. The one Washington wag who started saying that there were 3 exceptions to the ban on abortion that even the most conservative were willing to consider, and that was rape, incest, and me or my family. And I think often people who have political differences in a point in their own family life will see the issue of family planning and abortion. And so for all of those reasons, the National Organization for Women is looking at the issue of reproductive freedom, the right to self-determination, the right to privacy, as both fundamental and symbolic and organizing issues, whether in some cases it may be the right to be free from coercive use of Norplant if you are a poor woman, to some of the issues of lesbian and gay couples and access to artificial insemination, questions of life-saving embryonic stem cell research that will be cut off. All of these questions that are before the Congress, it is George W. standing off to the side when he thinks he's off mic at a Catholic Charities luncheon and announcing that his faith-based initiatives will be good to promote the anti-abortion rights agenda. And so when I look at all of those issues and I see the court, the Supreme Court, as a focus for those and so many other issues, I really feel strongly that it is the time to mobilize and to march and to be back in the streets. It's an outsider's strategy. But we are, those of us who are in favor of abortion rights, those of us who believe in lesbian and gay civil rights and bi and trans civil rights, and those of us who want to see the Violence Against Women Act funded and the Family and Medical Leave Act expanded and funded, those of us who want to get back in with the reauthorization of the welfare repeal bill and try to improve it. All of those issues that we care about, I think we can build and mobilize around politically by beginning this campaign, kicking off this campaign, marching in the streets on April 22nd. That'll cap 2 weeks of in-state lobbying when the senators are on their spring break, from April 7th to the April 22nd. And it will be followed up as well by virtual action. We will be inundating them with email, although I read a story today saying that the senators and Congress members are now getting up to 10,000 emails a day and they are blanket deleting. Have they not heard of bounce back messages? I mean, even now, and we're sort of technologically impaired, we have bounce back messages that at least acknowledge you've been sending us email. And so as we look at all of these Bush administration strategies to limit our reproductive freedom as metaphor, if you will, for the rest of the agenda, and as in and of themselves fundamentally important, we don't declare a state of emergency lightly. I know what it means to ask all of us to put aside our business as usual and to devote some real time and energy to rebuilding a movement that in many ways became complacent during the era of the Clinton administration. I fully appreciate the gravity of putting ourselves on such high alert, and at the same time, I simply refuse to be part of the generation that both won and then loses the right to privacy and to reproductive freedom. And I hope that all of us will take extraordinary measures in what I perceive to be very dangerous times. This is an opportunity, literally, to change the course of history and politics in the country. And I know that fighting together, we are up to that task. And so I thank you for all that you have done and all you're going to do. And I look forward to some discussion now.
Thank you so much for your comments. As always, insightful. We have microphones both on the bottom floor as well as on the top, and I'd like to ask each speaker to first introduce yourself, and remember that this is question and answer as opposed to statement and answer. First question.
Hi, my name is Mindy Leon. I'm a joint degree student with the Kennedy School and NYU School of Law. And shortly after I started at NYU, Barnett Slepian was killed in Buffalo. And first, just to point on women's organizing, it was incredibly tough to figure out what kind of response was happening. But finally I did, and I posted signs all over the law school. And this is a place where presumably everybody who was admitted came along with their essay saying that they were going to change the world and save women. At least half of them probably said that. And not a single person came with me, which I think also reflects my own failing in organizing. But I was stunned that people didn't care, that people didn't recognize that when doctors are being murdered for performing abortions, that means the right's in jeopardy. How do we convince, right now poor women are the ones who have trouble having access to reproductive freedom. How do we convince middle class, upper class white women that this is an issue that should matter?
I think part of what has to happen is that women have to tell their stories. And it is certainly easy to be in Boston or New York and see that perhaps it only is women who are poor, women who are in the military or are military dependents, Native American women who live on tribal lands, women in prison. I mean, you can go through the list and ask whose rights are next, and I assure you they are yours. But it's also the case that if you get some of the students who were here for the COOL conference this past week, there were some young women there from Georgia who are going to school in Georgia, and their campus has it's not a church-related school, but it's a small private school, and they have a rule on campus that students can't have sex. And so, of course, their health center does not have any birth control, any contraceptive information, much less devices or prescriptions. They can't get birth control. They can't get, of course, the morning after pill. There is not a program dealing with sexual assault on their campus. These are middle class and upper middle class students who are unable, where they're going to school, to have access to reproductive health information and services. So I think we need more of those young women telling their stories. I think we need more of the few remaining physicians who practiced when abortion was illegal, and illegal abortion was the leading cause of maternal death, to tell their stories. I think sometimes we get caught in this idea that we should not counter the imagery of the anti-abortion rights movement with anything other than soft music and flowers and choice, as opposed to the dead woman on the floor of the motel. Hey.
Hi, my name is Carrie Lips. I'm a second year at the Kennedy School. Ms. Ireland, when Clarence Thomas was accused of asking out an employee and telling off-color jokes, now defended his accuser and urged the Senate not to vote for his nomination. Years later, when it became clear that Bill Clinton lied under oath during a sexual harassment lawsuit, had sex with an intern and paid her with a job, and had used his employees to label his accusers stalkers and bimbos, now stood by the president. You didn't come to the defense of Paula Jones, Juanita Broderick, Kathleen Willey, or every other intern who worked with Monica but didn't get a paid job because they didn't have sex with the president. For some reason, you decided that this sexual predator deserved leniency. And given that history, I was wondering if you could explain how I should see you as anything but an arm of the Democratic Party, and if you regret communicating the message that sexual predators should be tolerated as long as they come from the political left.
Well, it's certainly an interesting question. It has almost no basis in fact. And thank goodness for websites which carry all of the messages that we put out. I will acknowledge that they were not often picked up because they weren't the story that the press wanted. So, for instance, I went on Larry King three times, and every single time he would say, "How come you're defending President Clinton?" And I would say, "I think President Clinton's behavior was indefensible." And then he would say, "Well, how come you're defending him?" "No, we're not defending him. We think he's indefensible in that regard." Just to go back and give a quick run through, we opposed Clarence Thomas on his stance on the issues long before the question of sexual harassment or lack of sexual harassment came up. When Anita Hill brought her story forward, the protests were because the United States Senate had tried to sweep it under the rug. And they had said, "We've closed the hearings, we're not going to reopen them, we don't have to reopen them, don't worry your little heads about it." And so we took a massive amount of protest to pressure them to reopen the hearings. It was only after we heard both of them testify under oath that we put on, I believe, Anita Hill buttons based on what we observed. I was the one who went on national television and said that if what Kathleen Willey said happened, it was not sexual harassment, it was sexual assault. It was a criminal assault. You can't put your hands on a woman's breast and put her hand on your genitals and call it a clumsy pass. I tried very hard to defend Paula Jones. We did put out news releases immediately when her story broke, as we did when Monica Lewinsky's story broke, saying that no CEO, whether it's the president of the country or the Mosquito Control Board supervisor, ought to be using a position of power to have sex with interns or to have sex with staff. And when I tried to meet with Paula Jones, she stood me up. I offered to fly to California to help her with her case. And her lawyer said to me when we were supposed to have our first phone call and she wasn't there, "Well, Paula had to go buy a dress." And I began to think that maybe we were being set up. That is, if I had a case against the most powerful man in the United States, arguably in the world, and I said, "Well, let's see, I have an opportunity to go talk to the largest group of feminist activists, the president of that group, or go to the mall. I'll go to the mall." It didn't seem to me that she really wanted our help, and I did begin to feel we were set up. I think having said all of that about President Clinton's alleged behavior and admitted behavior where it took place, that is a far different question than whether you overturn an election based on that. And that's where we felt that not only was there an incredible hypocrisy on the part of people like Bob Barr and Dan Burton, who are still not able to get over Clinton and are still wanting to hold hearings and having hearings about the Denise Rich pardon, Denise Rich's involvement and her husband, ex-husband's pardon. I mean, there were still people like Specter out there, even Specter using words like they were going to impeach the president. He's not even in office anymore. But I think it's a wholly different thing to say that sexual harassment, sexual adventurism, misbehavior, inappropriate behavior is not limited to one part of the political spectrum, and a different thing to say you overturn an election based on that, and that's where we drew the line. And I just have to say, an arm of the Democratic Party would not be out with a 3-week hunger strike in front of the White House protesting the welfare bill in 1996 before President Clinton went to the Democratic convention in Chicago. I was very hungry. We had said you have to be very careful what you said. We said we were going to go on a hunger strike until the bill came over from the House and the Senate, and he either signed it or didn't sign it. And instead of doing whatever magic and putting ever imprimatur and stamps and ribbons on it that they do in the Senate and House and bringing it over to the White House, they held it for 3 weeks. And I went for not the full 3 weeks, but one of our officers did. So be careful what you promise to do.
If we can take a speaker from the top.
Hi, my name is Jim Cruiser. I'm a first year at the college. Recently, Eminem performed on national TV, and his lyrics have been said to mock homosexuality and come close to advocating violence against women. Some people have defended his right to speak out, identifying his individual right, while some have said that his speech actually is a detriment to women's equality. So how ought people who are both feminists and liberals resolve this tension between individual rights and equality?
I think we have an obligation, not just a right, to counter that kind of hate speech with more speech. And that's what we did, and that is to use the visibility, the public spotlight that was on the Grammys and on Eminem to talk about what the culture reflects in honoring someone who, I mean, everybody got focused on the fact that he sang or rapped about killing his mother. He also talked about his sister's birthday and a bunch of his guys for a birthday present raping her, taking her virginity. And I mean, there's some really, if you haven't looked at the lyrics, if you haven't heard the lyrics, I would urge you to do that, because I do think that it is, I worry less about copycat crimes, although those take place, and more about the portrayal of that kind of hatred and violence as normal, as nothing to be particularly upset about. And so we did protest. I did go out to Los Angeles. I did take my fair share of abuse from those who were, excuse me, knee-jerking First Amendment rights, because I wasn't saying I wanted President Bush or William Rehnquist or anybody in, you know, Trent Lott deciding what we should hear or sing or portray, but rather using an opportunity to say that every single day, women, gays, and lesbians are first attacked with words, and then those words escalate to physical violence. And I think we have to talk about that and not just let it slide. But I don't think we want to empower the government to suppress that kind of speech, because I will tell you, for instance, with the government now deciding that so many libraries are deciding they have to have censors on their web, and so many schools are now putting in censors on their internet access, and those sites cut off Now's website from being put through because we talk about lesbians, because we talk about sex, because we talk about abortion, because we talk about all kinds of issues that don't make their filters.
Good evening, Ms. Ireland. My name is Rob Porter. I'm a junior here at the college. This evening, you've essentially staked yourself as having a necessarily adversarial relationship with the Bush administration on the question of abortion, and to be honest, I think have somewhat misrepresented some of their policies and some of their views. But even though I disagree with you fundamentally on the question of abortion, my question isn't adversarial in nature, and it's this. One of the things that President Bush has said is his primary agenda when it comes to abortion is not in overturning Roe v. Wade, but is in creating a culture which doesn't treasure the choice of abortion and living in a society in which there are fewer and fewer abortions. And my question for you is, what, as the president of now, are you willing to commit to do to work towards that sort of a society?
Whatever campaign promises witness carbon dioxide Bush intends to throw out or throw away, I think there is one promise he intends to keep, and that is the promise that he made in 1998, that he would do everything in his power to restrict abortion. Since he made that statement, he has obtained a lot more power, and he clearly intends to use it. Even before he was sworn in, he picked Ashcroft, who opposes birth control in its most popular and effective means, as well as abortion, even in cases of rape, incest, or danger to the health of the woman who's pregnant. He invoked the global gag rule, reinstated that his first day in office. He's put Tommy Thompson in HHS, where he will review the safety of RU-486 while nobody blinks about Viagra. And as I said, he announced that his faith-based initiatives would advance the anti-abortion rights cause. while he's not said he would appoint only anti-abortion rights justices, he has said that Scalia and Thomas are his most respected, and that he will look for so-called strict constructionists. Those are people who don't want to make progress, as far as I can see.
Well, it's clear that you disagree with his fundamental beliefs, but in terms of his policy proposals and in terms of what I just said was his priority.
Well, that's what you say his priority is, but what he's shown in his actions are something that is quite different from that. And if you look at the number of bills that are in Congress right now, and if you look at the policies that Bush has implemented that are already in his power, it's pretty clear what he wants to do. As far as your question about what we do to reduce the need for or the choice of abortion, I think that we have to start with things like sex education that actually educates students about sex. I don't think you can do abstinence only and have any realistic hope of... We need a lot more money into contraceptive research so that we have better, more effective contraception, and we need it more widely available. We don't need to be giving an opt-out to pharmacists who don't want to give the morning after pill, for instance, because they think it is immoral. And in some communities, there is one pharmacy. So I think there are a number of things we can do, and the other aspects that we can, historically what we've seen across the world is that you reduce the fertility and you reduce unwanted, especially teenage pregnancies, by creating more opportunities. And in fact, the direct correlation between increase in education and lower fertility is very clear. So I think that there are things we could do, but when I find, as I say, a John Ashcroft and the people he's picking who don't want the most effective forms of birth control and most popular forms of birth control because they work after an egg is fertilized and before it implants in the wall of the uterus, and that to those people is an abortifacient. So we may not have as much common ground. If we can work on education, if we can work on child care, if we can work on all of the ways that we can have and raise our children, but to me, you see, that includes raising the minimum wage. It includes expanding family and medical leave, and those are things that the administration won't work with us on.
Good evening, Ms. Ireland. My name is Wendy Maldonado. I'm a joint degree student between the Kennedy School and the MIT Sloan School of Management. I actually have a question from the international arena to ask you about. Mary Robinson was recently criticized for her decision to ask women at a meeting on racism in Tehran to cover their heads at this meeting. And I'd just be interested to know what you thought of her decision and what you would do in a similar position as the leader of an international agency. Thank you.
Well, I am finished with my term as now president this summer. I will have finished 10 years. I am termed out. And so I've been trying lots of other fantasies of what I will do. I hadn't yet thought of taking Mary Robinson's job, although I do understand she's going to step down. It is a very dicey issue when we move into international affairs to distinguish among traditional practices that are actually means of control and power over women, that are means of oppressing and keeping women from equality, and which are traditional practices that we may at any given point take a pass on, even if they are symbolic of a form of discrimination or distinction that we don't approve of from our cultural point of view. I think in the global work we have to follow the lead of the women in those countries. And so, for an example, when we worked on female genital mutilation, we took the lead from the women in Africa and the Middle Eastern countries where it's practiced, and their lead was to frame it as a health issue, that the cultural practice which was passed from women to women, that is, it was women who put this practice into implementation with their own daughters, didn't do it because they wanted to torment their daughters or torture them or hated them, but because they loved them, because they wanted them to be marriageable in a culture where often marriage was the only way of economic survival, or for some other reasons, and that it had to be framed in terms of health, because that was different than saying to these people, you are tormenting and torturing and violating the rights of your children. I might have disagreed about how to frame it, but those women said frame it in a health context, that's the way it's going to work here. And so we followed their lead. And I think in those international meetings, we can't really take it upon ourselves, any of us, to say to other women who are participating that they have to undertake a particular practice or abandon a particular practice, whether it's covering our heads or or wearing wedding rings. I mean, who knows what the given practice is? But I don't think that we can stumble over some of those pebbles in the path, however symbolically important they are, and end up missing these big boulders that we could be joining together on. So I really, I get myself in a lot of trouble that way. Let me just put it that way. I have had the stage stormed at a global conference that I put together once, so I'm probably the wrong person to ask.
Hi, I'm a student at School of Public Health, and well, according to research, there still is considerable disparity between men and women in their access to health care and in federal funding for research in gender-specific diseases. I would like to know if NOW has come up with any strategies to address this issue. Thank you.
You've picked an issue that in some ways almost seems to be a side of the angels issue these days in Washington. We worked a great deal with the National Institutes of Health and with the Office of Women's Health and research there. I think that those are areas where funding will continue. The politicians in particular who are against the majority opinion on certain issues, whether it's on abortion rights or Family and Medical Leave Act or whatever, find the health funding and the health research to be something that they can get behind. Mm-hmm. And so we are looking to work across various lines. In particular, I think our access has to be more through the women in medicine and in research, perhaps in the same way as addressing the last question, because they know the culture and know how to get things done there.
But I heard Congress is considering reviewing, a lot of things that OSHA has done in the past 10 years, but a lot of occupational injuries actually are affecting women. Actually, women compose like a larger percentage of occupational injuries because they're the kinds of professions they are in. And I want to know your position on this issue.
Well, we've been very strong in support of the ergonomic standards that, it was a long bit of work to come up with those, although, despite the portrayal that they were hundreds of pages that nobody could understand or comply with, it was actually, 6 or 8 pages of standards. The rest of it was the study results and, other publications or part of the publications that were designed to help implement them. I think it was a terrible decision to reverse that. The distinctions that I see with this current Congress, and I don't think there'll be much to get around it, is that if the funding, for instance, for the National Institutes for Health and the monies that go into medical schools that do research and into other pockets, into, in fact, some private sector pharmaceutical companies, that's going to flow. But if the money is going to if it's going to cost money, or if it's going to be a mandate of some sort on employers, it's not going to happen. And we can keep struggling with that, and eventually I think we change public opinion. And there again, I think we need a lot more of the women in particular who have repetitive motion injuries, and them telling their stories is the best way, I think, because nobody can say, oh no, that's not what happened to you.
But do you think that's going to change, like to be repealed or reversed, like overnight, the progress that has been made in the past 10 years?
A lot of it will be. But that, again, the answer to that depends on what we do. I mean, that is the answer. We ultimately, compared to, for instance, 1980 when Reagan came into office, we are light years ahead of where we were. We have so much more power. We have an organized feminist and women's rights movement that is all over the country. We went through the Equal Rights Amendment campaign, and while we never won the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, we did have enormous networks of now experienced activists who know how to give speeches, do fundraising, do press, all of that. And we also have moved public opinion. We have more of us on the inside of NIH and pharmaceutical companies. And now we have on top of that a layer of pissed off voters who feel the election was stolen from them, and whether you agree with that or not, that's another asset that we have right now. And I think that we can turn some of these things around. I think it only keeps coming to roll over us if we don't fight back.
Thank you.
And I think we have time for 2 more questions. Why don't we
You
take...
just don't have time for my answers. That's
Oh, no, we definitely have time for your answers. And I also have to say, on your last comment, most of the women with whom I've worked over the years, both here at Harvard, who work on women's issues, as well as in other organizations, were all trained by now. So it is, it's exactly right. One from above, and then this will be our last.
Thank you. First, I want to say thank you, Ms. Ireland, for coming to speak to us tonight. I hope you come many times in the future. I'm Joanna Veltri. I'm a second-year Master's in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. I have another international-related question. Recently, we saw a flurry of international criticism on the Taliban's destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas. Personally, I was saddened, but wondered how it was that we could have such high-profile objections to the destruction of historic statues when the rights of women are so horribly oppressed. Very few people, I hope, would disagree with that statement. However, in light of what you said before regarding sort of keying off of what women in a particular culture say in terms of leadership and how we approach these problems, I wonder what advice you might have for the international community concerned about the women in Afghanistan who effectively have no voice, have no opportunities to voice themselves in religious communities, never mind workplace, education, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I believe that the reason there was a lot of public outcry about the destruction of the statuary is because those are irreplaceable, and I think that women are seen as replaceable. I may be wrong in that, but I mean, it was the only thing that I could figure out is that somehow that was seen as something that was unique in its value. I would also echo your comments about the women in Afghanistan, and I don't use the word oppress or oppression lightly. I very rarely use the word oppression about what we face in this country as women. I might talk about discrimination or barriers. I know, in the relative sense, we don't face the kind of oppression that a lot of women do. I would say, however, that we ought to consider that women and men are oppressed by the Taliban. Men are also facing extraordinary violence and oppression. Women have perhaps lost ground further, faster, and are more cloistered in their homes and have even less access to health care and the like. The women from Afghanistan and the men from Afghanistan who are outside of that country, I think, are some of the most effective voices and those who need to help us learn what to do there. The problem, of course, is that our access right now is only to our own government in terms of what we can do. And in fact, most of the global work that feminists do in this country has to be directed toward what the United States government does. We fund enormous portions of the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations. On a good year, we pay our dues to the United Nations. And we have an impact there. We can see and keep pressure on our country in terms of refugee policy, asylum policies for women from Afghanistan, funding for scholarships, which we've seen some effort toward, visibility on the issues, not recognizing the Taliban as a legitimate government, the pressure on the private sector, because of course the big question of whether UNICAL or somebody is going to put a pipeline across the Afghanistan, and what that will mean in terms of acknowledgement. But it is one of those seemingly intractable problems, and at the same time, 15 years ago, I would have stood here and said to you that South Africa was an intractable problem. And we saw extraordinary change, principally instituted and motivated by the diaspora, the South Africans who were around the world. And I hope that at some point we'll reach that critical mass politically and economically. Our interests will not overwhelm our interests in the human rights situations and the issue of democracy. Hey.
Larry Lewis, Boston tour guide. I have just a question. You said, if I heard you right at the end of your speech, you briefly alluded to your organization having become complacent. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Well, I think that other people became complacent. I think that after the, well, oh gosh, this is a whole lecture which I won't give. After the close of the Reagan-Bush era, if you will, in 1992, for instance, we were at the end of a massive campaign, and part of it was focused, a great deal of focus was on the concern for whether we were going to lose the right to abortion and birth control. We had a huge march in Washington. There was enormous participation, a huge gender gap in the election, and I think that when Bill Clinton was elected, a lot of people breathed a sigh of relief and said, now we can go home to our normal everyday lives, not realizing that if we are going to preserve any of the rights, if we're going to make any further progress, this is our normal life. We have to always find a way to make room for some activism and always find a place in our work lives, in our family lives, in our communities to have some impact, however small it may seem. It does all add up. And so many people, I think, put their, and it's why I really kind of bristled about your question about being an arm of the Democratic Party, because I think it's extraordinarily important that there be independent political forces in the country. The Democratic Party and the two parties right now on their platforms pretty clearly the women's rights support, from my point of view, would be with the Democratic Party platform, and yet so many Democrats run away from the platform, not on it. So many Republicans, at least at the local level, and sometimes in Congress, witness Olympia Snowe and some others who you can't really predict by their party label what they're going to stand for so much. And so I do think there's always the danger when we make progress that people will think we've arrived, that when someone comes into the White House who is better on some issues, that everyone relaxes. I, of course, had a great deal of difficulty. We didn't endorse Clinton. We didn't endorse Gore. I thought they were better than their rivals in the election, but I didn't want to put now's imprimatur on their policies always. I thought the idea of campaigning on ending welfare as we know it, as opposed to let's end poverty as we know it, as we say in Florida, sucked swamp water. That's a legal term, came out of the elections work down there. And so I do think that there was a lot of complacency, and I think now's role then was to continue to have a structure in place where people could plug in. We are, I mean, just on our internet joins, for instance, we have been averaging, I don't know, 75 new joins on the internet a week, and the week of the inauguration, it went up to something like 274 in one day. Now, I don't expect that's going to continue, but I do expect that every one of our chapters around the country has to be prepared for those people who now want to do something, and they don't even quite know what. And that's why I think our emergency campaign and the emergency action on April 22nd has to give the visibility so that people go, oh, there's a place I could put some time and make a difference. And maybe their issue is violence against women, maybe their issue is minimum wage, maybe their issue is the ergonomic standards. But if they see us out in the street, and frankly, people don't march on ergonomic standards, perhaps they should. If you look at what women say they care about, 85% still think that we face job discrimination, 84% think that equal pay is a problem, 90% prefer Social Security being secure to getting a tax cut, but they're not out marching on those things. That's why I say I think sometimes we have to take the issues that make people passionate and organize around those, and that's what we'll do now to get the complacency shaken off. We've got to keep waving, hey, look at what they're doing over here. I know you're busy, but look. And that's what we'll be doing. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So come march with us.
Thank you for coming out this evening, and if people would like further information, both on the National Organization for Women and upcoming events from the Women in Public Policy Program, there's a table with some materials.
Thank you very much.
Great to see you.